GenFriends. I'm your host, Cheri Hudson Passey from Carolina Girl Genealogy, and another fabulous panel has joined me tonight. We've got Melissa Barker, our archive lady. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. We've got Shelley Murphy, our family tree girl. Hi, Shelley.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here too.
So nice to see you. And Laura Hedgecock from Treasure Chest of Memories is here. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Glad you're here as well. And last but not least, and our returning guest who's been real busy for the last little while, we've got Dan Earl, our family history guy, is here. Hey, Dan.
Hey, glad to be back.
We are so glad that you're back. It's always fun. It's like a little family reunion. You know, people have to take time off and go do other things and come back. So we're glad you're here. We thought tonight it would be an interesting thing to talk about oral history and the importance of oral histories in your genealogy research. Sometimes we kind of overlook those things. There are cultures that don't have anything written down, and all they have is their oral history. I watched a video the other night that somebody put together about some of the oral history projects that Family Search had put together. And they had a man from the Pacific Islands that had gone back. I think they said he could recite back 30 generations. Isn't that amazing? Absolutely amazing, because things weren't written down and they just memorized them, and they would tell their children and their children would memorize it, and then their children. African American populations is the same thing. They have a lot of oral history. The Irish have a lot of oral history. Any other ethnic groups that you guys can think of that have
I think everybody's got some, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Thinking about it, it's just who actually does it.
Right.
But I think all the cultures, the Scottish, I'm thinking that oral history was coming down just like the Irish history.
Sure, probably. Exactly.
And I think of roots. Remember Alex Haley and getting back there, and that guy was citing that history, you know.
Exactly.
I think, and I don't, you may have mentioned this, Cheri, but I think one of the major ones that I think about, especially ones that aren't written down, are the Native Americans.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
You know,
so many. And I think sometimes people think, well, you know, nothing's written down, we can't prove it. But those oral histories are just as important. And they're just go ahead, Laura.
I wonder, I don't know if this is right. Here's my question or suspicion is there's a lot of traditions or ethnicities where they didn't have someone who was always the scribe, always writing them down. So they weren't dependent on written records. And so they had to become competent, or what, I can't think of the right word, with accurate oral history.
Yes.
And so I think there's other cultures where we have stories that we pass down, but we're kind of loosey-goosey. I mean, I know my family.
This is true.
We have lots of oral, stories that have been passed down by mouth, but I think we're somewhere in the 30-40% accusy bracket. I mean, I don't think you can call that as oral history.
Did you hear me, Laura?
What'd you say?
I said, we didn't say they were all accurate. We did not say that. That'll come up, I'm sure, in the discussion.
Right, because I think when you talk, the oral histories in Africa, you think of the Native Americans or the First Peoples. I think it is a tradition where oral histories are preserved and studied and repeated, which is different than when a lot of us when we say, oh, I'm going to do an oral history interview.
Yes.
Well, I think too, like for most of us in the West, we sort of place this like extra value on written records. And I'm going to put my anthropologist hat on because I got my degree in anthropology from Arizona State. And we used to call societies that didn't write things down, we used to call them pre-literate societies, right? And that's really sort of a snooty, derogatory way of looking at things, right? Super like elitist for those of us that have alphabet systems. But what anthropologists realized way before a lot of folks in the genealogy community was that there's a lot of value to those oral histories, and a lot of times those oral histories can be more accurate than the paper histories. Just because it's written down doesn't make it as true as something, because those oral historians for a lot of native and tribal peoples it was something that they had to get exactly right, verbatim, every single time, and they were trained by their elders. It wasn't just they're like, nah, I'll just kind of make something up. It was this repetition until they got it 100% accurate every single time without variation, and they would add to that history based off of what they were seeing, and then pass that history down to the next generation and the next generation with the same intensity of accuracy that we just don't get in written records, right? There's plenty of reasons for people to lie on written records, but there's
You never
less
know
reasons.
who's
So
given the info on some
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I really think it's wonderful that Family Search has developed so many of these oral history projects where they are sending people out throughout the world to record. Like you said, I saw this video where they were recording this man doing, I mean, he just sat there and it was a Pacific Islander, and he just went through the whole list down to him, all the way through. And I think that's fascinating. And I'm glad that they're doing these projects so that they are recorded, so these things don't get lost. And I know that they did the same thing, and they're still working, I believe, on the ones in Africa and the different countries in Africa. They are working on those as well. So that's something that you could look up if you go to the Family Search Wiki and you type in oral histories. You get a whole list of different places where they're going, and different ideas and thoughts about oral histories and how important they are. And I also thought it would be good to talk about where we can find oral histories. There are oral histories that were recorded years ago that a lot of us don't even know are out there.
Yeah.
And they may be in places where your ancestors lived. They may not talk about your ancestor, but they're talking about the time period and the location where your ancestor lived. And
Community.
so the whole community. And so you can glean so much information about them, and you can find them in libraries and archives, all sorts of places. Just I found a couple just by Googling oral history in a certain place, and to see what they may have. I know that our little library here in Myrtle Beach has an oral history project that they've got. It was on VCR tapes. Now they're putting it into modern technology so you can go and watch it. But they interviewed all these older people about the history of Myrtle Beach from when there was no hotels, no oceans, nothing out there. Everybody thought that land was worthless, including my grandfather. I can the house on the beach that I've always wanted. They just thought, oh, why? I don't want to go buy that land. It's worthless. It's swampland, and who wants to sit on the beach and things like that. So they're everywhere. I know that some libraries have recordings of people who worked in, say, an industry in the area, and what it was like to work in that industry. Well, if your ancestor worked in that industry, in that plant, in that that was his occupation, people are talking about it. And so you can go and learn a little bit more about how they lived. Yes, Laura.
So the Holocaust Museum in DC has not only a collection of oral history interviews, they're perpetuating it, because you can go on their website and they have guidelines to help you prepare before you even contact the interviewee on setting it up and what questions to ask, so that you can, or if you know someone, you can do this interview and add to the archives.
That's
which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, Shelley.
Go
ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dan.
What we're talking about, about the Holocaust Museum, they every so often will have a live interview, live oral history. And my class, my students, we tuned in for that. They had one on International Holocaust Memorial Day,
in April.
No, this was last month.
Yeah,
So
Oh, okay, the one in January. Okay.
yeah, the one in
January.
January with the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. That's is and they had this lady on there who was at Auschwitz, and was on a death march and was in several other death camps and concentration camps and managed to survive with her sister. And just for the value of that, in terms of not forgetting, but also to allow another generation to be a witness to those
Yes.
stories, so that those stories are not forgotten.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Shelley, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, first, the International African American Museum, which will open in Charleston, in their Center for Family History, they will have a story booth in there. So people can
Oh,
step
cool.
in, do the
I was
little
just going to
recording.
mention the one in Salt Lake, so I'm glad that they're going to have one there too. Right.
Yeah, they'll have one in there. And also, I wanted to share that Story Worth. My daughter just had me do Story Worth.
Yes.
And so that's a new one. So now I'm uploading pictures to go with some of the things I commented, and then that prints out into a book. And then the last thing I wanted to share, and we rarely talk about DNA on here per se, but I have a DNA connection, and people know that I'm mixed and this, that, and other. This person is 100% Nigerian. And so we've talked on all his family's still there. He's in New Jersey, came over for college, this, that, and the other. But we talked about oral history. And I asked him, I said, here, we've got this DNA connection. And of course, right now, I don't know what side of the family it comes on and things like that. And he said, you know, he told me where all his family are from in Nigeria and everything. And he said, well, we don't have any written records for back at this time, but there is in the oral history, and somebody did start writing it down. He said, and someone in the family years ago started putting the stories in a book. And there was a story of a great great grandfather's brother that was kidnapped on the slave trade.
Wow.
That's my connection, right?
Wow, that's amazing.
And he is the only one that shows up so far after all this time with, you know, DNA, that I have somebody that has the Nigerian, I mean, specifically, but there's no shared matches yet, you know, so I got history from him, and I said, is there a chance I could read that book? You know, the family book. And I said, just have somebody take pictures of where they're talking about great grand uncle or whatever of your grandfathers or whoever, what happened with that scenario or something, because that might be my one that came into this country, you know, on whichever side he ends up on, you know. So,
and that oral history may be the only clue that you would have ever gotten to who it was.
Exactly. Well, so, DNA.
DNA, but that oral history helps to be able to make that connection, right?
And then, because if that person came in, I know where people came in.
Yeah.
And if there's a chance, because they would have a name for him. And so I'm hoping, you know, if I could at least get a couple pages, but I thought, boy, if I would ever, you know, if I could think about that, like my Scottish person, I can go right to Aberdeenshire, but I cannot go to Africa yet.
That's right.
Yet. And
you
will.
And
go right
you will.
to the village.
You will.
So I'm hoping. Yeah.
Dan, you put a comment in saying that there's a website for the Korean War oral histories. That's interesting.
Where's that?
Yeah, so I tried to get it, but anytime I try to do anything other than just stare straight ahead, my video goes wonky.
I'll look it up.
Yeah.
Can I Google it and try to find it?
You should be able to Google
I'll Google it, Shelley.
Okay.
In my class, when we covered the Korean War, we watched Korean War stories, and there's another one for Vietnam stories where they talk about they interview young men that went over there to Vietnam. They interview young men that chose not to serve for a variety of reasons, and it's a really balanced approach. The Korean War one has stories from male soldiers, females that served in the military. And so you get a variety, African American, Caucasian American, Native American stories. There it is, KoreanWarLegacy.org.
We'll make sure we get all these links in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
they're popping
you
them
should
in
be
the
able to
chat.
access the chat after this is done, Cheri. So I'm just putting the different links in.
Yeah, thank you. You know, Dan, you just gave me a thought. So my dad fought in Vietnam, and he would never ever talk really about the stories. I'm thinking, I know some of the major campaigns he was a part of, and I'm wondering if there are others who are part of that oral history project that could talk about it, that could help give me an idea of what he may have gone through.
Yeah,
That
that's
kind of
great context.
even if
they weren't in the even if they weren't in the same unit,
yeah,
it's the same context that could give you a lot. It could inform you about a lot of things.
And that's how we use these things. Sometimes we look at them and say, "Oh, my dad was there, or my mom was there, or my grandpa was there," but they don't mention them in this, so it doesn't do me any good. And we need to realize that we need to learn from everything that we can find that talks about the things that they went through. And that helps us to understand them. It helps us to understand what records may have been created that maybe we didn't find before, and just kind of help them with their story, help us to understand their stories.
I think that's particularly important with those that served during wartime. And that served in combat roles, because a lot of times they just don't want to talk about it because it was such a traumatic experience, which is completely understandable. But without that talking about it, that history is lost. So my dad was a funeral director, and he would often have older people work for him, and they're get a discount when services were needed. And there was this one fellow that worked for my dad who was at the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
And he never talked to his family about it. And I was assigned that battle for part of a history class in middle school. And I went and I just said, "Hey, you served in World War II. Did you have anything to do with the Battle of the Bulge?" And he just said, "Yes, but I don't want to talk about it."
Oh.
And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, I've got this project. So if you change your mind, let me know. Otherwise, I've got to go upstairs to the 1984 World Book Encyclopedia and look up some stuff." And then a couple days later, he came in and asked my dad if he could speak with me. And he goes, "I'm ready to talk."
Oh, wow.
And,
I love it.
He went through and told me everything. And he's like, my wife doesn't know this. My children don't know this. But this is what the Battle of the Bulge was really like, if you were there. And it was just a powerful thing. And of course, 12-year-old Dan didn't think to get the tape recorder and record all of that. So it's here, right? And so I need to then do my job and get those stories out too. But you repeat that over and over again, whether it's World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Iraq wars, any of that. Those experiences are very traumatic, but they're history that needs to be told and needs to be passed to another generation. So
and another reason too is I have tried to get veterans that I know to be involved with elementary school because they always do a 5th grade project about interviewing someone older than you about something in history. And I have found that veterans that didn't see combat don't want to be the ones that leave the record. They feel like the people that served overseas, the people that saw, they almost feel like it's not really their story to tell, although they can tell their parts of it. But I've seen like the veteran community themselves, they want the combat veterans to tell those stories.
That's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Melissa, what kind of oral histories do you have in your archives?
Well, we have some military. Our historical society right now is planning a World War II event for August. And so years ago, the Historical Society actually interviewed the remaining World War II veterans that were in our county. And so we have those on tape, and they were on VHS, and we have digitized them. But we also have just local people that the Historical Society video, and this is video and audio. A lot of them have been transcribed. But you were talking about others in the community. If you can't find an oral history one for your ancestor, Because if you listen to the other ones or read the other ones, they may mention your ancestor or mention your family because they interacted. Another example, oral histories, I treat oral histories kind of like online family trees. You know, I record them, I document them, and then I try to prove them.
Right.
You know, and so one I did prove, I think I proved for my husband's third great grandfather. He was actually shot and killed in the early 19 teens. And the story for his family was that he was shot and killed by this gentleman, and the gentleman was going to the fields with his shotgun and his dog and to work. And his dog started barking at this tree, and he looked up in the tree, and there was my husband's ancestor in the tree with his shotgun. And so they shot at each other, and he ended up being shot and killed. Well, the guy was not charged. He was a young guy in his 20s, and it really upset him, and he moved away from the area. It was actually a dispute over a land boundary dispute because they were next door to each other. And so he went off and became a minister. He lived and he died, you know, as an older man. And so I always wanted to know if this was true. And so I found a living relative of his, of this Mr. Lockhart was his last name. And it was his nephew. And I met him and I said, I'm not going to tell you my story. I said, I want you to tell me your story. And normally when you get two stories, they're not 100% the same. When he told me his story, it was exactly the story that my husband's family had.
Wow.
So that gave it a lot of credence to me.
Wow.
Coming from the other side, per se.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I have found some documents that, believe it or not, there was nothing in the newspaper. He didn't have a death certificate. Of course, this is in rural Tennessee. There was one court document where it shows that he was brought up against for the grand jury, and it was not a true bill. So I guess it was for self-defense. But you know, always talk to others and don't tell them your side or your story.
Exactly.
See what they say and see how much of it is the same.
Right. Oh, Shelley just, go ahead, Laura, and then I'll get to where Shelley just.
What I was going to say, the way our memories work, though, one of the things that helps the things that we recall the easiest and the things we recall with the most accuracy tend to be the things that had a great emotional impact on us. So it helps if there was a lot of sensory details too, because those are memory cues. So it would almost make sense, though, that was like such an event in both families' lives. That it was remembered with great accuracy. And shared.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So I posted in about the Veterans History Project that NARA did. And then I put in the Born in Slavery slave narratives on the Federal Writers Project. And there's oral histories there. And I will say I did research on a relative that was World War II. He was killed in World War II, November 30th, 1944. But I searched the survivors of the plane crash, and there was 3. And so when we contacted him and interviewed him, very similar to what was said earlier, his family did not know that he was in the plane crash. He went to the Stalag, this, that, and the other. And there was 3 people survived of the 9 that were in the plane. And if I remember right, it was either a B-24 or B-15. This is World War II. And so he ended up doing oral history with the, whatever it is, something 8th Air Force or whatever out in Arizona. So after that, he started telling the story. And again, he had a plane crash, became prisoner of war, you know, this, that, and other. But he had not shared that with his family.
Interesting.
He had not.
Well, Shelley,
I think about that, you know.
I like that you brought up the slave narratives, because I've used those a couple of times as I've done research. None of them have ever talked about my slave owning ancestors or their plantations or their land or whatever, but they talked about what things were like in that area. And so that helps me kind of get a feel for what was going on and maybe lead me to maybe other records that I might be able to use. But it really just gives you a sense of what was going on and in a way that you can't get when you're just looking at paper documents. Paper documents are hard. They tell us hard things that have happened, but when you hear someone's voice talking about their experiences, it's a whole new level of understanding. It's a whole new level. So yeah, it's something that we've got to not overlook when we are doing our research. We have got to look and see. And like I said, look at the libraries, the universities, the archives, the museums, any place in the location that your ancestor may have lived that could have somehow, come up with it says my internet is unstable. So if I pop out, I'll come back in. Anyway, what I want to do now is I want to turn to Dan, because Dan was telling us.
Let me say something before you go to that. Get to the local, like historical and genealogical societies too, because absolutely. A lot of them over the years, whether it's because it's a commemoration of, let's just say 150th of the county or the city or whatever, they'll do stuff like this. And also when you're looking for these records, don't just look for oral histories. Look for diaries.
Yes.
Look for scrapbooks.
Journals.
Things like that people have put together that have been donated to archives like that. I always tell people to read the neighbors' diaries, because you never know if your ancestor might be mentioned.
I like that. Let's read the neighbors' diaries.
Yeah, so
I might find out things I never wanted to know.
Exactly. Dan, will you tell us about the project that you had your students?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I've decided I'm not going to move next door to Melissa anytime soon. Don't need her rummaging through. So I did an oral history project with my students, and I work in a division of my school district called Special Populations, and so the group of students that I work with are kind of a unique group. So they're between 17 and 24. They've all been removed themselves or have been removed from the high school environment for a variety of reasons. And now they're coming back to earn their general education diploma. And so these kids are my heroes. Like they just really want to do good. They struggle, but they get back up. And as long as they get back up one more time, then they fall down. They're just great, right? And I was really kind of struggling because a lot of times they don't have that first connection back to their past. They don't. Some of them don't have. They may have a parent, or if they do, that parent doesn't want to talk about anything, or they may no longer have connections to their parents or grandparents or anyone. And so it's something that I had to be really sensitive about. But I really wanted them to learn about the value of oral history, and to start thinking about history in a different way, because I want them to really think like historians and not just learn names and dates and facts and stuff. What I call big man history, right? They learn about big men and important stuff like that, like we used to back in the 80s. But really want them to think like historians. And so I was kind of scratching my head, and I've got this really good writer friend of mine who was a B-52 pilot during the Cold War, and has flown missions that are so classified, they are still classified, and he still will not talk about them to anyone, including me, no matter how many times I beg him, no matter how much ice cream I bribe him with, he just won't divulge them. And so I remember one time I asked him a question. I was like, hey, because he said that he had mentioned that he speaks Russian a little bit. And I was like, oh, have you been to Russia? He's like, no, but I've seen it. I was like, oh, okay. And he's
that's
like,
a good one.
Right. He's
good
like, that's
answer.
all I'll say. Right. And so when we were starting this unit on the Cold War and nuclear proliferation and all these things, and how there was a sort of one-upmanship throughout the 60s and 70s, and then the sort of warming of the Cold War during the Reagan Gorbachev era, and so I told my students, like, hey, we have this opportunity to interview this guy. Now he lives in Utah, and time-wise with my class, it just didn't work out to have him live to answer live questions. so what I did is I sort of gave my students the general background, like, hey, this guy was a B-52 bomber pilot. He will admit that he's flown with live nukes on board. He will readily admit to that. He won't tell me where he was flying with those. There's some things that he's open about. Once a mission has been declassified, he's more than happy to talk to people about it. But he keeps very close to his chest those things that are classified, because he's like, I swore an oath. He goes, and I take that very, very seriously, to uphold the Constitution and to not talk about these things. And so I gave my students those limitations. Like, there's going to be things that he can't talk about. So if you have a question like, what's the most top secret mission that you flew? He's just, I can't talk about it still.
That'd be my first question.
Right. So don't ask that question, right? But like, ask some other questions. And so again, this is a group, it's sort of on the surface, sort of a ragtag group of kids. Some of them, most of them have addiction issues. Some of them are homeless. Some of them just any issue that you can think of, these students have. And they ask some of the greatest questions ever.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah. So like, one of them was like, how did you personally feel about nuclear weapons and their use? And
wow,
would you have felt morally compromised if you had to drop a nuclear weapon, and knowing that it would destroy people, right? And in a horrible way, which is a great question to ask.
Brilliant.
And he answered it very, very succinctly, very clearly. I gave him the questions in advance, so he had time, so he wouldn't feel shanghaied by questions like that. And just, but I mean, some of them were innocent enough, like, why did you want to become an Air Force officer? Why, just different, what was the scariest moment you've ever had in an airplane? Because that's not classified, him being scared. And
that sounds like they were really trying to put themselves in his shoes.
They really were, which was great to see, because they were really sort of getting into the point of all that. Let's see if I can get my video started again. Hang on. And so they were really asking a lot of those super important questions. And so he and I just set up a Zoom meeting, just the two of us. And I just introduced him and said, okay, let's go through the questions. And I think we as a class, we boiled it down to 15 questions. And it was about an hour and a half interview for 15 questions. And we just recorded it. And then we watched it in class. And I, of course, I'm a teacher, so there was a worksheet involved, and they had to like write down things like, I couldn't be a teacher and watch a video, but it was really kind of a cool little exercise, especially for teachers that work with populations where there may not be an immediate connection to the past, refugees, things like that, or where that connection is really, really painful and something that doesn't want to be talked about, to still help them see the value in oral history and asking questions and learning that way, instead of just they could have learned about the Cold War by just reading about it in a book, but that wasn't as enriching as talking to someone who was there. And and he even threw in stuff about, like, because after his time in the Air Force, he was in the Air Force Reserve and was running a radar station somewhere in the general vicinity of the Caribbean, and like helped this country take down a drug plane that had like $60 million worth of cocaine in it or something like that.
My gosh.
So he was like, I can't tell you where I was, because that's still top secret, because there's still a base there.
There's something there.
Yeah.
There's the U.S. Air Force is still there, so I can't tell you where I was, but just this is the general vicinity, somewhere between Veracruz and Barbados, somewhere in not any further north than Miami, but somewhere in that general vicinity. And so it was just a great way for students to feel a connection to history that they sometimes don't, especially in marginalized populations where history just is this abstract thing that really old white people do. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And for them to interview, yes, an old white person. No offense, Dave. But like an older
No
white
offense.
person. Yeah. But like just to have that experience of asking those questions and learning directly from someone that was there and have their questions heard. And
Yes.
and it was
Yeah.
great as a teacher. I could see them just, it's an hour and a half and there's no explosions. It's just a guy talking. He did bring out a Model B-52 at one point, was showing banking maneuvers and stuff. Just really he just gets really excited about it. But it was just really, it's just great to see them light up when it was their question.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's like,
yeah.
my question, like, and they're just like super attentive.
And
Like,
they're proud.
yeah, they're like, that was my question. That was my question. They're like high-fiving and just your fist bumps and everything. It was just great. And so
Will this video be saved someplace so people can see it in the future? That's what I mean.
Yeah, it's up on YouTube. I set the video to private, so it's not searchable. That was his request, but I did give him access to the link, so he can share it with his children and grandchildren.
Good.
So
Okay.
that's so those questions being asked have been preserved for their family.
Wow.
He said he wasn't comfortable with me just leaving it out there on YouTube to make it searchable. Like he would not talk about like even the airspeed at which a B-52 can fly, because he's like, that's still technically classified.
They're still flying.
Yeah, I was like, I was on the Air Force website and they said this. He goes, don't believe everything that's on the internet.
Oh.
He's like, you really think the U.S. Air Force would let the enemy know how fast our planes can fly? If they know how fast they can fly, they can time,
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Which is what they did during World War II, pretty much.
And I can attest to the fact that that they really keep everything, because my father was in the Air Force for 20 years, from 1960 to 1980. He started out in like working in the PX and stuff, but he went into computer operations when computers were like, I mean, he had a whole room full that now is our cell phones,
Yeah.
But I tried and tried and tried to get him to talk, and we and him were very close. I was a daddy's girl, and we were very close, and he told me everything. He never kept anything from me. Even up until the last year of his life, I tried. He would tell me that he did work on some very top secret things, but he just would not. And I'm thinking to myself, it's been since you retired in 1980. I'm sure anything that you can tell me is already out there. But he would not, because he took an oath, and it's important to him.
Look how long it took for them to talk about the Navajo.
Yeah.
And the code talkers.
Yes.
And then a movie came out.
Yes.
That's why you don't want to know, they just told what happened and what, all the secrets from there. I posted about American Red Cross.
Okay.
And because they have places overseas, typically on bases, but they have a historical component that people don't tap into for research. And they also put on functions and things. And the World War II guy that I talked about earlier and stuff, because I have a picture of him, and it was at a Red Cross social function. This is in the night before the bombing run that they were going on and he gets killed on. But they had a social the night before, and we got a picture of him. And then there's another picture of the interview. I mean, him giving an interview for BBC. And anyway, but they have some oral history stuff, and people have to think that's another source for you to check out.
I never thought about the Red Cross.
Yes.
Laura. So Shelley, is that the American Red Cross, or is that like there's an international Red Cross?
That's the American Red Cross that was overseas, but you got I don't know about, I can talk about American Red Cross, but the international, and then there's another Red Crescent Society, they all mirrored after one. We're the American one for North America. Well, yeah, USA, North American type thing. But yes, there is a department. And again, I haven't worked for Red Cross now for years, but I volunteered when my husband was active duty. And of course, up until I moved to Virginia,
as you think about it, I'll bet you there is some type of oral history.
They've got records.
for about just anything you can think of, occupations, events.
Letters.
Yeah, but I've actually looked for an archive online. I know that they have offices in DC because I have a picture of my grandmother wearing what I'm pretty sure is a Red Cross uniform, and I'm pretty sure it was World War I. And I want to find out more about what it would have been and whether it would have been
like.
stateside and stuff.
Yeah.
And I have not found anything online.
I would go to the local chapter first and talk to them and let them get the connection. And again, I handled the military stuff. You know, my charge was when people were overseas or even stateside, if somebody died in the family, this, that, and other, and they requested that soldier to come home or whatever, they had the Red Cross duty was to verify the information, submit it back to the commander, getting that soldier home for whatever the event was, death, merit, whatever, and stuff. And so that was my world there, was dealing with the military and the military spouse at the same time. So,
and I like that advice, Shelley, is to start local and see what they've done locally.
Yeah, I like it too.
That's probably where you're going to find a lot of the more interesting information about your location is what they've done locally. Like I said, those colleges and libraries and archives and historical societies and genealogy societies, those local people who want to preserve the things that happened there. And so that's where I would start, and then start moving out to see if I could find anything else.
This group I was just doing a presentation to, most of them were new in research, and one of the messages that I was getting across was, where do you think Ancestry, Family Search, you know, all these places that have these databases, where did they get their information from? And I said, it came from the local level. It didn't appear there and come down. They had to come local. So before you get on the internet, I want you to exhaust that local, you know,
always
whatever is there.
Best advice. But then also, if you're going to go on the internet, try places, the bigger places like the international, I can't talk tonight, the International African American Museum, the other museums that are
National African American Museum
in Washington,
all
the Smithsonian,
Jewish,
all of them, all of these big museums, they have projects too that you might not think to look. And so
don't forget overseas.
Don't forget overseas either, because
Liverpool, Bristol.
You just never know where, especially if your family came from, you know, and most of us did, came from other countries. And so they may have talked to people at that time period, or people that had immigrated, or people, you know, you never know what you're going to find. And I think that sometimes we limit ourselves and we think, oh, they would never talk to anybody about that.
They're from a farm. They were country folks. They're not going to know anything. And they're the ones that blow you away.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I would really encourage everybody to just look into oral history and see what you can find. And of course, create your own oral history with your own family. You could start a project like Dan did with your own family. You can find a relative that your children or your grandchildren may want to know more about, and do the same kind of thing. What kind of questions would you like to ask them? Let's
forget the aunties and the grandmas.
You can use the StoryCorps app. You know, it's spelled corpse, but StoryCorps, and they have guided conversation. It's really meant to be between two people. They have great suggestions and prompts. But they will let you, once you're done, you can save it for yourself, but you can also upload it to the Library of Congress.
Yes, which I think is great. And we had mentioned the Family Histories, the Family Search Library. It's going to be hard to change because they've changed their name recently. The Family Search Library, the one in Salt Lake, and Shelley's saying that the one that's going to be in the museum in Charleston will have a booth. You can go in, and I did this with my friend that I've known since I was 12. We went and sat down in Salt Lake and just talked about all of our crazy antics that we did as a kid. And we've got that now because you start on this conversation, you forget the camera is there.
Yeah.
And you just start talking. And then, of course, we ended up going back to some of our old haunts years later. And it was so fun because that conversation got us remembering these things. And then we were able to do it. So things like that, just start a conversation, use photos, anything you think of, an old document that you might come across and say, talk to me about this. And just don't just sit down and say, okay, tell me your whole life, because that's not going to happen. Dan, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, this oral history is super, super important for young people to build emotional resilience.
Yes.
There's been study after study that shows that the single greatest determination of a young person's ability to be resilient in difficult circumstances is how much they know about their family's history. It has nothing to do with their breakfast, their participation in sports, academic aptitude. It's just how much they know about their family's history. And if they can answer basic questions like, how did my parents meet? Where were my parents born? Just basic things like that just make such a huge difference, which is why oral histories, even if it's just discussed at the dinner table, is super important. Stupid video. Super important.
We can still hear you.
I'm glad other language didn't come out from
Yeah.
Right.
So to augment that, I have also read these studies about developing resilience and successful in youth, and actually having relationships with adults outside of their families is another huge thing.
Oh, yeah.
And that is something we can foster when we put youth together with other people and let them engage in an oral history type dialogue and kind of walk exactly what Dan's students were trying to do, walk in those other shoes. What would have it been like way back then? In the 60s. Oh my gosh, that's so old.
Yeah, but there are programs out. I'm sorry, I was just going to say real quick, there are programs out there where the youth can go in and talk to people in nursing homes and, get their stories. And I think that's a wonderful idea, and it builds that bond. And I know youth that have gone back, they may have done this as a project.
Yeah.
Because they kind of had to, it was a project, but they got to the point where they created this relationship with this person, and that continued on. So, that there is a big emotional and spiritual component to being able to make those connections and learn from other people, from other generations. And they learn too that they're a lot alike, that just because this person is older doesn't mean that they don't have the same feelings about things. They may have lived through different circumstances, but the emotions are still there, and the family connections are still there. The sadness, what makes them sad, or what made them happy, or those types of things are the same. Doesn't matter if you're 82 or 16. So I think it's really good for our youth to do things like that. So
I've got one big takeaway here.
Okay.
And it's based on what Dan wrote in the chat.
Okay.
Every one of you also have that oral history story.
Yes.
You need to do the self-oral histories, just like you're telling for, us to go get an auntie or grandma or parents or whoever.
Exactly.
We also, as researchers, look what we know and what we have come across. So I think the emphasis on there, what Dan is saying, talk about recording self-oral histories.
Yes.
Just like we start with genealogy, start with yourself and work your way back for whoever you have and stuff. And I think we can build our own that can be handed down or even shared if you're the family historian or whatever. So I think that's a huge takeaway. So thank you on that, Dan, because we typically don't think of ourselves as researchers. We're always looking at somebody else,
Well, and to that point too, I mean, it doesn't preclude writing your stories, which I also think, because with technology now, it's very straightforward to transcribe those later.
Sure is.
And so you can have both. I mean, I actually think recording is another way of writing. because you want to have that conversational tone.
Absolutely.
Dan?
Well, I think it's important too that we're not just looking back at older people, but also recording younger people. Because I mean, in 20 or 30 years, I'm pretty sure my grandchildren would love to hear and see a recording of their mom when she's 6.
Yes.
And her cute little squeaky voice and her giant glasses that make her eyes 50 times bigger than they already are, like, and just walking around. Like, they're just going to think that's like super adorable that like their mom.
They're going to think that's super hilarious.
Yeah,
right?
too. Yeah.
And so oral history moves in both directions, right?
It
So a lot
does.
of times we don't think of like those old, home movies that we made as being oral histories, but in reality they are, right? So my aunt recorded a bunch of Christmases from the 80s, and we were at her house, and she had gotten them transferred to DVDs, and we were watching them. And my kids were just delighted to see like their dad, tiny little, but then my grandmother, who was an immigrant from Hungary, was there, and I hadn't heard her voice in nearly 20 years, right? And her accent was way heavier than I remember in my head, right? And they're like, he sounds like Count Chocula. I was like, that's rude. She's your great grandmother. Stop doing that. But yes, she does. Like
Count Chocula.
I love it.
Be respectful of your ancestors. But
yeah, I was gonna say before Dan said that, I was gonna say we may have oral histories right underneath our noses. Talking about those old family movies. I've got some that I need to get transferred, and they're not talkies. They're of my parents when they were teenagers, but also think about the little short videos you take on your phone of your grandchildren, of just a short event at Christmas or whatever it is, that birthday party when they're blowing out the candles, all these little short snippets. And one of the things that I can tell you, and this is, I know we're fixing to end, but archivists are concerned by the fact that a lot of photographs and videos and emails and texts and all of the stuff is not getting saved.
They're on their phones and they're not being preserved.
Exactly. Well, right. And so, but it's just as a genealogist, someone at home, as archivist, we preserve government information that way, what we call born digital. But as genealogists, it's kind of weird. We don't think about that being the records of tomorrow.
That's
very and true. So it's something that I think it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to be a huge realization one day when we go, wait a minute, none of this stuff was saved.
Yeah, none of it was saved.
And here we're trying to go back now, a couple 100 years and more, but it's no different.
Yeah.
It's no different.
I have to tell you a funny story real quick about watching old family videos, because you gather the family around and you watch the old family videos. And we were watching some of the earlier ones where one of my daughters wasn't even born yet. And she was kind of little. She was probably 5 or 6 when she was watching this video, and she was furious that she wasn't in this video. She could not understand why
got left out.
She got left out. She wasn't born. She couldn't have been in the video. And so I kind of think that helped her understand maybe time a little bit in the family before she came along in the family. She was so mad, and then she cried, and we're trying to explain to her, you just weren't born yet. It's really okay. We got all these other videos.
We have those in our family. My youngest was mad too. There's videos. Well, you shouldn't have gone on a trip before I was born.
Exactly. You should have done nothing before I was born.
Yeah. And you were speaking of museums, and I know we're going to go, but it won't take but a second. So when I grew up, there was the night before Christmas was like a diorama in the big department store downtown. And Christmas Eve, Dad would take us down and he would read the night before Christmas diorama. And that was just part of our traditions. Well, when the store closed, they donated the dioramas to a local museum. And Dad went with his video camera and he filmed each little diorama and read it. So we have him still reading it. I've digitized it. But because I digitized it, I could also, when my sister's, Ellen, her daughter, came along, my parents were long gone. So I could buy one of those recordable night before Christmas books, and I could put her grandpa reading her the book because I had the digital file.
Right.
I love that. That is
Isn't that
beautiful.
thoughtful? That was so sweet that he did that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, thank you.
And that's stuff that people can do now and create the history now.
He did it back in 1997. You can do it.
Definitely do it today. Well, I appreciate you guys coming and all your examples and helps. And I hope we have encouraged our listeners to go find oral histories that can help them with their research and create oral histories that can help generations to come. But before we end, we just wanted to give our condolences to one of our genealogy greats, Audrey Collins, passed away. Everybody knew her as this bright-spirited redhead who we just loved, who worked, she was Scottish, but she was working in the British archives for years and years, well known to many of us genealogists, would come to the States a lot and join us at conferences, and she's just going to be sorely missed. And we got the news today, and we just wanted to pay tribute to her and send our love to all of her friends and all of her family. And with that, we will see you next time. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on GenFriends. Bye.
Bye. Have a good one.